A dead, pitch-black night hung over Libya, with only a faint horizon line separating silent space from the hostile world boiling below. At an altitude of 15 miles, Major Brian Schul felt completely safe piloting the SR-71 Blackbird, a machine that, by all laws of logic, was unreachable by any earthly weapon. It seemed this aircraft soared too high for interceptors and moved too fast for any missiles of that era. In 2 decades of service, not a single Blackbird had been lost in combat. But on that April evening in 1986, that statistic nearly turned to ash. Warning lights suddenly flared in the cockpit. Aging Soviet Libyan air defense systems had achieved the impossible. They had managed to lock their radars onto the most elusive target in aviation history. Schul instantly realized the scale of the catastrophe. Any piloting error, any split-second hesitation, and the myth of the SR-71's invulnerability would collapse along with the wreckage of the plane. Fiery missile trails were already reaching up from the ground, while the instrument panel blinded the pilot with a furious red glow. At that moment, the Blackbird was flying slightly slower than its usual rhythm due to a course correction. The choice was simple: death or a risk no one before them had dared to take. Schul pushed the throttles to the wall, forcing the engines into a regime far beyond their rated specifications. No one knew at that moment if the titanium airframe could withstand such extreme acceleration. This scene became the pinnacle in the history of a machine that always existed on the edge of the impossible. But to understand how America created this space-age reconnaissance craft, we must go back in time, to the moment of the shameful downing of its predecessor, which changed the rules of the game in the sky forever. The path to creating the legendary Blackbird began not with triumph, but with a loud international scandal that nearly turned the Cold War hot. On May 1st, 1960, news broke that became a true nightmare for Washington. A U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance plane had been shot down over the Soviet Union. Pilot Francis Gary Powers managed to eject, but fell straight into the hands of the Soviet military along with the debris of his top-secret aircraft. For the Americans, it was a crushing blow. Along with the plane falling from 70,000 feet, the belief that extreme altitude made reconnaissance immune to punishment also collapsed. While President Eisenhower tried to make excuses, calling the flight a weather research mission, Moscow displayed the cameras and spy equipment to the entire world. It became clear, if one missile could reach the U-2, every subsequent mission would turn into a deadly lottery. At this critical moment, an aviation legend enters the stage: Clarence Kelly Johnson, the chief designer of the secret Skunk Works division. He had sensed the end of the U-2 era even before Powers was captured. Johnson's credo was uncompromising: better to do the impossible than to give the enemy a chance. The task set by the government seemed like pure madness to the engineers of that time. They were required to create a machine that could climb above 80,000 feet, would maintain stable flight at speeds exceeding Mach 3, would become virtually invisible to the radars of the era, and all of this had to be implemented in less than 2 years. Experts considered the project a utopia, but Johnson was adamant. He believed that by locking the best engineers behind high fences and working around the clock, they could create a ghost that would outrun physics itself. Thus began the A-12 program, the secret ancestor of the Blackbird, where the primary weapons were not guns, but speed and stealth. Following official approval of the program, Washington plunged the A-12 project into an atmosphere of total secrecy. At the Skunk Works facilities in Burbank, massive fences were erected and armed guards were stationed. Even many high-ranking generals were unaware of the development, and workers signed non-disclosure agreements with oversight stricter than that of nuclear facilities. Kelly Johnson understood that simply improving the characteristics of the U-2 would not be enough. A radically new approach was needed. The engineering team implemented solutions that would later be called stealth technology. The aircraft's vertical stabilizers were canted inward so that radar beams would reflect away rather than back to the receiver. The fuselage was flattened, adding sharp edges, chines, that ran from the nose to the wing. These edges created vortices for stability while simultaneously scattering radio waves. But the main problem was temperature. At speeds over Mach 3, the skin heated up to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Under such conditions, ordinary aluminum would have simply turned into a puddle. So Johnson made the risky decision to build the machine out of titanium. Working with this metal turned into a technological nightmare. Titanium was incredibly temperamental. It would crack at the slightest mistake, and tools made of ordinary steel were destroyed upon contact with the workpieces. Engineers had to create an entirely new set of tools, also made of titanium. Furthermore, an ironic political dilemma arose. The United States did not possess sufficient reserves of titanium ore, and most of the metal had to be purchased through front companies from its primary adversary, the Soviet Union. Even once assembled, the aircraft behaved strangely. On the ground, its panels did not fit tightly together, causing the fuel system to leak constantly. Mechanics jokingly called the machine permanently drunk because puddles of kerosene constantly stood beneath it. However, there was a calculation behind this. Only in flight, when the titanium heated up and expanded, did the seams become perfectly sealed. By the spring of 1962, this gleaming titanium silhouette was ready for its first dash into the sky. To force a multi-ton titanium structure to fly 3 times faster than sound, Kelly Johnson required engines that did not yet exist in nature. The J-58 power plants became a true engineering masterpiece. They were hybrids. At low speeds, they functioned like ordinary turbojets, but at hypersonic speeds, they transformed into ramjets. The most recognizable feature was the massive, movable cones in the air intakes. At high speeds, they retracted inward, managing shock waves and literally forcing incandescent air into the combustion chamber. Without this precision work with the physics of air, the aircraft would have simply suffocated in the stratosphere. Even the fuel created for it was special, JP7 grade kerosene. It was so stable that you could extinguish cigarette butts in it. It would not ignite from an ordinary spark. To start the engines, it was necessary to inject a special chemical, triethylborane. It was this substance that produced the famous bright green flash during startup that startled casual onlookers. On April 30th, 1962, at a secret base in Nevada known as Area 51, the moment of truth arrived. Test pilot Louis Schalk brought the unpainted prototype, shimmering with bare titanium, onto the runway. Around him, there was only sand, mountains, and a graveyard silence. When the engines roared, spitting green flame, the machine lifted off and vanished into the sky as easily as if gravity did not apply to it. This flight proved the Skunk Works calculations were correct, but the hardest part lay ahead, turning this prototype into a full-fledged combat tool capable of hanging over enemy territory for hours. Vietnam was already waiting for its invisible guest, and soon the world would learn of an operation codenamed Black Shield. By the mid-60s, the secret A-12 was ready for real business. The theater of operations was Vietnam. The operation was codenamed Black Shield, but this was no ordinary military tour of duty. The status of the mission was so delicate that the pilots were not officially listed as members of the Air Force. They were civilian CIA contractors who had no names, ranks, or even dog tags. In the event of a crash on enemy territory, the government would simply pretend they had no idea who these people were. Okinawa became the base for the Blackbirds. From there, the the titanium birds took to the sky to photograph the entire territory of North Vietnam in a single sortie. For enemy anti-aircraft crews, the appearance of the A-12 was a shock. Radars barely had time to detect the target before it vanished over the horizon. Soviet specialists assisting Vietnam furiously launched dozens of missiles after the elusive shadow, but they simply could not catch a craft flying 3 times faster than sound. Pilots remembered this time as working in another dimension. At an altitude of 25 kilometers, the sky turned deep purple, almost black, while below, clouds and the flashes of explosions drifted by, appearing tiny and surreal from such a height. In pressurized suits resembling spacesuits, the men felt like explorers of an alien planet rather than participants in a war. It was in Vietnam that the aircraft proved its primary concept: speed is the best armor. Not a single missile or interceptor could even get close to it. However, the success of the A-12 gave rise to a new problem. The military wanted the same toy for themselves, but with broader capabilities. Thus began the transformation of the secret CIA project into the legendary SR-71 that the whole world would come to know. While the A-12 project was successfully operating for the CIA, the U.S. Air Force leadership was growing restless. They wanted a similar aircraft, but one that was more durable and capable of carrying even more reconnaissance equipment. This led to the modification we know today. It became longer, heavier, and gained a second seat for a reconnaissance systems officer. One of the most absurd and amusing stories in aviation is associated with the naming of this machine. Initially, the aircraft was supposed to be called the RS-71, which stood for Reconnaissance Strike. But in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson, giving an official speech to journalists, mixed up the letters and called it the SR-71. The military had no choice but to rewrite thousands of pages of secret documentation overnight to align reality with the president's words. Thus, the name Strategic Reconnaissance was born. But why did it become black? The first prototypes gleamed with bare titanium, but that was unsuitable for combat missions. Engineers proposed a special ferrite-based paint. It performed 2 critical functions simultaneously. First, it absorbed radio waves, making the aircraft even less visible to radar. Second, the black color was best at radiating heat into space. At speeds of Mach 3, friction against the air was so intense that the paint helped shed hundreds of degrees from the airframe. As a result, the aircraft acquired its sinister and elegant appearance. Pilots immediately nicknamed it Habu, after a black venomous snake found in Japan. The machine transformed into the ultimate predator of the stratosphere, for which no borders or restricted zones existed. Preparation for a flight in the Blackbird resembled a spacecraft launch more than a conventional aviation sortie. Pilots went through rigorous rituals. A mandatory item a few hours before takeoff was a breakfast of steak and eggs. This high-protein diet wasn't for pleasure. It minimized bowel activity during the flight, as they had to spend many hours in a pressure suit without the possibility of attending to earthly needs. The suits themselves were masterpieces of engineering. They were full-fledged, high-pressure spacesuits, exactly like the ones Americans later wore on the space shuttles. Without them, at an altitude of 25 kilometers, a pilot's blood would boil instantly in the event of depressurization. They were put on with the help of assistants, after which the pilots were literally led by the arms to the aircraft, carrying portable cooling systems behind them. Inside the cockpit, there was no more room than in a phone booth. Visibility was severely limited, surrounded by hundreds of toggle switches and analog gauges. But the most surprising thing was the temperature regime. While cosmic cold reigned outside, the windshield heated up to 300 degrees Celsius due to air friction. Pilots put this heat to good use. They pressed tubes of food against the glass to warm up their lunch. At the same time, touching the glass itself with a bare hand was impossible. It would instantly burn through a glove. Flying the SR-71 was a truly religious experience. There, at the edge of the atmosphere, pilots saw the curvature of the Earth and the deep blue-black space above, realizing that at that moment they were the fastest and highest-flying people on the planet. Despite its grandeur, the Blackbird was an incredibly expensive and temperamental instrument. This was not the kind of aircraft you could simply roll out of the hangar and send into battle. Every SR-71 mission resembled a complex surgical operation involving hundreds of people. The cost of a single flight hour was simply astronomical, ranging from $85,000 to $200,000 in various years. But money was only the tip of the iceberg. The primary resource was time. For every hour spent in the sky, up to a week of complex technical maintenance on the ground was required. After every return from the inferno of the stratosphere, the titanium airframe required a meticulous inspection for microcracks. Fuel logistics were a particular headache. Since the aircraft was fueled with unique JP7 kerosene, which was incompatible with any other machine in the world, the U.S. Air Force had to create an entire fleet of specialized KC-135Q tankers. These flying gas stations were stationed at various points around the globe so the Blackbird could reach its objective. Because the aircraft constantly wept fuel on the ground, it was never fully fueled before takeoff. It was simply too dangerous. The pattern was always the same: take off with half-empty tanks, immediate aerial refueling, and only then a sharp leap to altitude, where the metal heated up, the seams sealed, and the machine became a cohesive whole. It was an insanely complex and expensive mechanism that remained in service only because the information it brought back was worth more than any gold. The primary secret to the Blackbird's survivability was not just its speed, but also its unique electronic warfare suite. Antennas and transmitters were hidden along the entire fuselage, creating true chaos for enemy radars around the aircraft. When Soviet or Libyan air defense operators attempted to lock onto the target, their screens were blanketed by a veil of interference, or they saw dozens of false targets. But even if a missile managed to latch onto a real track, pure physics came into play. Over its entire operational history, approximately 4,000 anti-aircraft missiles were fired at the SR-71. Not one of them reached its target. The pilot's tactic was insultingly simple. As soon as the sensors warned of a lock-on or a launch, the pilot simply added throttle. At speeds exceeding 3,000 kilometers per hour, the aircraft outran the blast wave itself. Missiles designed to intercept conventional targets simply went haywire at such velocities. Their computing systems couldn't calculate an intercept trajectory in time, and the warheads exploded helplessly far behind in the titanium giant's wake. Soviet designers attempted to respond by creating the MiG-25 interceptor, which could also reach immense speeds, but even it could only fly in that mode for a few minutes at the risk of melting its own engines. Meanwhile, the Blackbird felt like a fish in water in that hypersonic hell, continuing its flight for hours. It was a game of cat and mouse, where the cat simply didn't have the breath to catch its prey. In the history of the Cold War, there was little room for compassion, but one incident over the Baltic Sea in 1987 became a legend of true combat brotherhood. On that day, an SR-71 was performing a routine reconnaissance flight along the borders of the Warsaw Pact. Suddenly, one of the titanium giant's engines exploded. For any other aircraft, this would have meant the end. But for the Blackbird, at supersonic speeds, it was a catastrophe squared. The machine bled speed rapidly and began falling from an altitude of 25 kilometers, trailing a plume of smoke. The pilots desperately fought to keep the plane airborne, realizing they were becoming easy prey. Soviet radars instantly locked on to the distressed target. MiG-25 interceptors scrambled from airfields in East Germany and the Baltics. The end seemed inevitable, either captivity or a crash in neutral waters. But at that moment, intervention came from an unexpected source. The Swedish Air Force, maintaining their neutrality, scrambled their Viggen fighters. Upon seeing the SR-71 in distress, the Swedish pilots made an unprecedented decision. Instead of attacking the intruder, they formed a protective combat formation around the crippled Blackbird. The Swedish pilots literally shielded the American machine with their own aircraft, making it clear to the Soviet interceptors, "To get to this target, you'll have to shoot through us." This living wall allowed the Blackbird to limp into West German airspace and make an emergency landing. For a long time, this story remained classified, and only decades later did the participants of those events receive their well-deserved awards. This episode proved that even in an era of great confrontation, at an altitude of thousands of meters, humanity could prove stronger than politics. By the late 80s, clouds began to gather over the Blackbird, and this time the threat came not from anti-aircraft missiles, but from the quiet offices of the Pentagon. Despite all its records, the aircraft became a hostage to its own exclusivity. It was too complex, too temperamental, and most importantly, incredibly expensive in an era when the military budget was being ruthlessly slashed. Space technology became the primary argument for the program's opponents. A new generation of spy satellites promised what the Blackbird could not: 24-hour surveillance without risking pilots' lives, and without the need to deploy an entire army of technicians for a single sortie. Why pay hundreds of thousands of dollars per flight hour for a titanium bird if you can simply switch a signal from a satellite already in orbit? Proponents of the SR-71 resisted fiercely. They offered a compelling point. Satellite orbits are predictable. An enemy always knows when a space eye is passing overhead and simply hides their equipment in hangars. The Blackbird, however, was unpredictable. It could appear anywhere on the planet at any time, photograph what was hidden, and vanish before the enemy could even sound the alarm. But the mathematics of large numbers defeated the passion for aviation. In 1989, the U.S. Air Force made the difficult decision to officially decommission the SR-71. It seemed like the end of an entire era. However, before heading to museums forever, the Blackbird decided to go out with a bang, proving to the world that its speed remained an unreachable dream for any other craft on the planet. Before finally sending the titanium giants to museum hangars, the Air Force Command decided to give them a farewell tour that felt more like a triumphal procession. On March 6, 1990, one of the Blackbirds, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Ed Yielding, was rolled out onto the runway in Los Angeles. The task was simple, yet daring: cross the entire United States from coast to coast in front of the whole country. As the engines engaged afterburners and the aircraft vanished into the sky over the Pacific, the stopwatches froze. This was no ordinary flight. It was a demonstration of absolute superiority that no production aircraft in the world has ever surpassed. The Blackbird streaked across the country like a meteor. While ordinary passenger liners were only gaining altitude, the SR-71 was already flying over its third state. The result shocked even the experts. The distance from Los Angeles to Washington was covered in just 67 minutes and 54 seconds. Along the way, the crew casually set 4 more world records on various segments of the route. The average speed exceeded 3,000 kilometers per hour. People in the cities along the path heard only the double crack of a sonic boom when the plane was already hundreds of miles away. These achievements were officially entered into all international aviation record books, and they remain unbroken to this day. Immediately after landing, this particular aircraft was sent to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. It seemed the story should have ended there, But the fate of the Blackbird turned out to be far more complicated. The machine, which had been officially decommissioned, would return to the sky more than once to prove that no replacement for it had ever been found. Despite the ceremonial send-off to museums, the story of the Blackbird did not end there. In the mid-90s, serious debates erupted in the U.S. Congress. It turned out that the vaunted spy satellites could not always handle tasks in global hotspots. When there was an urgent need to obtain detailed images of mobile missile launchers or troop movements in real time, the cumbersome orbital craft often found themselves in a blind spot. Under heavy pressure from politicians and intelligence veterans who remembered the titanium giant's effectiveness, the Pentagon did the unthinkable. They decided to reactivate the SR-71 program. Several mothballed machines were literally pulled from storage, dusted off, and prepared for a return to service. It was a unique time. Veteran pilots returned to duty to train a new generation of aviators in handling this headstrong beast. However, the joy was short-lived. Opponents of the program within the Department of Defense had no intention of backing down. They pointed out that the world had changed, the Cold War was over, and maintaining a tiny fleet of 3 or 4 aircraft cost the budget as much as maintaining an entire airbase. Political battles continued for several years. The planes were cleared for flight, only to be grounded again. Ultimately, in 1998, financial pragmatism finally defeated military nostalgia. The program was closed a second time, and this time, permanently for the armed forces. But before the J-58 engines fell silent forever, the aircraft found work in civilian science, becoming a tool for those who dreamed of the stars. When the military finally abandoned the Blackbird, 2 machines found a home in NASA hangars. To scientists, this aircraft was not a spy, but a unique flying laboratory. Only the SR-71 could remain for long periods in conditions that simulated flight on the edge of space. It was used to test sensors for future satellites, study hypersonic aerodynamics, and even verify theories on how high temperatures affect metal structures in real time. For NASA, these were golden years. An aircraft created for war and secrets was now helping humanity understand how to build the vehicles of the future. But maintaining even 2 such machines in flight-ready condition was an overwhelming burden. Spare parts were running out, and the unique fuel had ceased to be produced in necessary volumes. The final chord struck in October 1999 at Edwards Air Force Base in California. It was a massive air show that gathered thousands of people from all over the country. When the black arrow of the SR-71 lifted off the runway for the last time and surged into the sky on afterburners, silence fell over the stands. The pilot accelerated the machine, made a farewell bank, and unleashed a sound that shook not only the windows of the buildings, but the hearts of the program's veterans. Many in the crowd did not hide their tears. People understood they were witnessing the sunset of an entire era, when human genius challenged physics and won. After landing, the J-58 engines fell silent forever. The aircraft sat still, and out of habit, kerosene began to drip from it, as if the machine were weeping for its own departure. The Blackbird had finally become a museum piece, leaving behind a void that even the most modern drones could not fill. More than a quarter century has passed since the last Blackbird touched its wheels to the concrete, but it still seems like an alien from the distant future. If you place a modern 5th-generation fighter next to an SR-71, the latter will still look more advanced. This is the central mystery of Kelly Johnson. How, in the era of slide rules and drafting tables, they managed to create a machine that cannot be surpassed even today, in the age of supercomputers. The answer lies in the fact that the Blackbird was built at the very limit of human and technological capability. Today, creating such an aircraft would cost trillions, not billions, of dollars. Modern drones and satellites are more efficient, cheaper, and safer. But none possess that charisma and raw power that allowed this titanium arrow to pierce the space above any point on the globe with impunity. The SR-71 left behind more than just a stack of world records that will likely never be broken by a production aircraft. It left behind the belief that nothing is impossible for engineering thought. The technologies refined on it, from stealth coatings to complex alloys and engine control systems, laid the foundation for everything that flies today. Today, the Blackbirds stand frozen in museum halls, reminding us of a time when the sky had no borders and speed was the only form of protection. And although a replacement for the Habu in the form of hypersonic drones is already looming on the horizon, in the hearts of aviation enthusiasts, the SR-71 will forever remain the one and only king of the stratosphere. A machine that didn't just fly faster than everyone else, but literally outran its time by an entire century.